We are recording because that's how they get on YouTube. We are lucky to have Sarah Saint as our speaker tonight and Flex as our co-presenter who's going to be talking about the Transgender Task Force. So let's just talk about a couple of housekeeping rules. First of all, welcome. And use the chat if you have questions as the night goes along. Please send those questions to Liz or me. My name's Sue, and we'll get those questions to Sarah. If we have time, we're going to have a Q&A, and you'll be able to unmute yourself and speak for yourself. But if you have a question as we're going along, please put them in the chat. And just a couple little Zoom tricks. If you're on a computer, not a phone or a tablet, but on a laptop or a computer, Alt-A will mute or unmute you, and Alt-V, like Victor, will turn your video on or off. And if you're on a Mac, it's Option A and Option V. So that's kind of the rules. That's about it. We're very flexible. We will go with the flow. And we want to get your questions answered and your interests addressed. So the first thing, I'd like to thank Liz Lennon, who is part of the Human Rights Department staff, and she's going to be taking care of us tonight and making sure we do all things correctly. So I'd like you to meet Flex, who, let me just I've got all kinds of monitors and screens going on. Okay, Flex Jones has been a longtime activist and advocate in North Carolina. He's the CEO and founder of Fifth Avenue Alliance, an LGBT transgender stability assistance project. He serves as second chair of the NC Transgender Political Coalition, and he served as transgender regional coordinator, of Tech NC 2018-19, and he facilitates the Carolina Transgender of Color Community Support Group. He is chair of GTTF. So Flex has just a huge background. If you don't know Flex, you can find out about him all over the internet. Just spell Jones with a Z and you'll find him. So Flex, would you please say hi and tell us about the Transgender Task Force?
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. I appreciate being here as well, and thank you for allowing me to be here this busy evening. You are right. You can find me at Jones, J-O-N-E-Z. My mother can find me, anyone else can. So just a little bit about the GTTF. It began sometime last year. I can't recall the dates because I'm getting older. And the idea is to actually give awareness to the transgender community and support in the Guilford, Greensboro area, and allowing the community to be more seen in a way that's positive and gain access to assistance with services that we as transgender individuals sometimes are not able to have access to, and educate the community that is growing here in Greensboro, Guilford County area. But really to give us the services that we need to address housing, education, youth and wellness, legal assistance that we need as community members in 2022 on forward. So I'm excited to be part of the task force. Many of the members of the task force are part of the transgender community, or they are gender nonconforming. So we're putting all our energy toward making sure that our community siblings, or we call community siblings or community members, are going to be comfortable living in an area that is more accommodating to their needs in a way that's allowing them to be comfortable and live daily in their stable lives. So I think that's all put back in one big old lump sum. But a lot of things we're doing now is, I will let you know, we are working towards our homelessness, which is a big number in the Carolinas already. So we're working towards that and accommodating our community and letting them be part in some of the things that we're doing with the commission itself.
Flex, can you tell us a little bit about where the task force came from? And if you're interested in going to meetings, what do you do? How's that work? Can you talk a little bit about the task force?
Well, I'm going to be really honest with you. I was very impressed that the mayor of Guilford, of the Greensboro area was really enthusiastic in creating this. And with that being said, when you have a mayor involved on your county level, that's awesome to me, because I am involved politically on a political level. So that is awesome to know that this area has done something on a county level, basically, then on a state level. I wish everyone else would do it in North Carolina. So anybody else in North Carolina, start a task force. But it began with the idea of the mayor and the commission there, the HRC commission there, and that's where we began. And if you want to take part, you could reach out to myself or those of us here that are on these lives. We could direct you in the right directions with our meetings as well.
Right. Task force meetings are open to the public. Currently, they're on Zoom. And Liz, can you put in the chat what the link is to sign up for those emails that tell you when the meetings are? The city has a really good alert system. I get emails of everything from what roads are closed because there's a water main break on Wendover, which I find to be helpful to know. And it tells you when every meeting is. You can sign up for only the emails that you want. So Liz will put that in the chat when she finds it, and we can go to there. So Flex, just to kind of sum it up, what does the Transgender Task Force actually do? What's their mission? What are they supposed to accomplish?
In plain layman terms, I'll make it as easy as possible to allow us to be comfortable where we are in our lives, to educate others, to let them understand the difference instead of judging the difference, to give us assistance where we can be more of an asset to ourselves and society. That's really what it's for. Because as a transgender individual, sometimes we cannot even be a good asset to ourselves or even to society because of the biasness that we have to deal with and the trauma.
Does anybody have any questions about the Transgender Task Force, or questions for Flex? Well, that was a good presentation. Nobody's got any questions. Okay. We're going to move on to, we're very lucky to have Sarah Saint with us tonight. Sarah and I have gotten to know each other a little bit over the past couple of weeks as we're preparing for what's going on. And let me tell you a little bit about Sarah. Sarah's a lawyer, and I married one. I once said I'd never willingly talk to one again if I didn't have to sleep with them, but but Sarah she advises and litigates on behalf of public and private educational institutions and school boards on all kinds of education law issues, including special education and disability issues, civil rights laws, and tort claims. She also represents businesses where she works toward resolving disputes, litigating in state and federal court when necessary. And Sarah, and this will surprise no one, Sarah has a particular focus on diversity and civil rights issues, including issues related to race, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and religion. Sarah's been elected, included, and nominated for a host of wonderful awards, including being in the legal elite in Business North Carolina for the Young Guns category of 2022. There's a whole list of these things on her website at the law firm. We'll get that link to you in a second. But on March 11th, there was a news article, 2022, the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld the lower court ruling that allows same-sex couples to receive domestic violence protective orders in cases where the couple is unmarried and does not live together. That suit was brought by another attorney there, Eric David and Sarah, and they filed, I may have said that wrong, they filed an amicus brief with the North Carolina Court of Appeals on behalf of a bunch of nonprofit organizations that work for LGBTQ plus individuals. So we are, I'm sure she's going to talk about that, so I don't want to read the entire case to you, but we are thrilled that Sarah's here. If you have a question, please direct it to Liz or Sue in the chat, and we'll get to, when we get to Q&A, we'll unmute microphones. Sarah, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Sue. I'm very excited to be here to talk with y'all about transgender legal protections. I do spend a lot of time working with governmental agencies and with businesses and counseling and training them on civil rights laws, including these laws that are applicable to transgender individuals, as well as sexual orientation, disability, religion, race, all those sorts of things. But I also spend a good amount of my time representing trans people who are looking for legal recognition of their identification. So wanting a legal name change, wanting to correct the gender marker on their birth certificate, passport, driver's license, those sorts of things. So I spent a lot of time working on those issues as well, which is how I got involved, Sue, in working on these amicus briefs for the Court of Appeals case and the turn into the Supreme Court case, where we finally have equality for domestic violence protections, both in heterosexual relationships and in same-sex relationships. So we're very excited about that development in North Carolina, and that there is protection there for same-sex couples. So I am, like I said, very excited to talk with y'all tonight. I have to do the standard lawyer disclaimer that everything I say tonight is not legal advice. It is strictly legal information. It does not create an attorney-client relationship between me and you fine folks. It's not promised to be the absolute most up-to-date information. If you have specific inquiries about your own situation, things that are troubling you, I encourage you to reach out to an attorney who can advise you specifically. Unfortunately, I can't do that tonight. I'm happy to provide legal information, answer general questions about the law, but for specific things about you and your situation, please consult your own counsel privately, not here in our public forum. And as Sue said, please include your questions either to Sue or to Liz, and there will be breaks in the presentation where we will talk about specific questions. And Sue's going to interrupt me from time to time and stop me and ask me questions. So I'm excited about that. So let's get started. So tonight we are talking about some lingo for folks who may not know different words that people use when they're talking about gender identity, sexual orientation. Then we're going to talk about legal protections related to discrimination in the LGBTQ space. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite things to talk about, which is how to change your name, how to change your gender marker on your government identification documents. And the last one I want to talk about is things to think about in the healthcare space. There's a lot of buzz going on right now about transgender healthcare. And so I want to talk about some protections that are available for transgender people in the healthcare space. All right, so first, our lingo. This is a broad overview of different words that we use when we're talking about gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression, those sorts of things. This is not an exhaustive list. I know, Sue, you said you were going to send around a really helpful article from the Washington Post that does a great job outlining some more words, but this will be enough to get us started through tonight. So gender identity is your gender. It is who you know yourself to be, who you feel you are. It is not something that is imposed on you by anybody else. It is you. Medical professionals call this your brain sex. And it is, if you feel that you're a man, if you feel that you're a woman, if you feel like something else entirely, non-binary, agender, genderqueer, gender fluid, there are a whole host of different genders out there. And we are having wonderful conversations now about what people's gender identities are. So gender identity is who you know yourself to be. Gender expression is the clothes that you put on your body. It is how you demonstrate your gender expression. So people can have the gender identity of a woman, but dress more masculinely, talk more masculinely, that doesn't make them any less or any more of a woman. Your gender expression is different from your gender identity. Some people's gender expression more closely aligns to what people expect their gender expression to be. Some people's doesn't, for a variety of different reasons. And so it's important that if you see somebody dressed a certain way, acting a certain way, looking a certain way, you may know things about their gender expression, but you're not guaranteed to know anything about their gender identity unless they tell you. You can't always tell based on how they look. So then I want to talk about transgender and cisgender. Transgender is an umbrella term that encompasses people whose gender identity or their gender expression doesn't align with what we think as a society makes sense for their sex that was assigned at birth. And when I say sex assigned at birth, I mean whether it was an M or an F that was written on somebody's birth certificate. So transgender is like if you're assigned female at birth and your gender is a man, or your gender is non-binary, then you could be transgender. Cisgender is the opposite. It is where your gender identity or expression aligns with the standard societal expectations of your sex assigned at birth. So then we talk about people transitioning. This is when you're moving from living outwardly as the gender that you were assigned at birth to the gender that you are. That is considered a transition. It is not changing from one thing to another. Your gender identity has always been you. People just didn't know that. So the transition is you outwardly expressing your true gender identity. And then I want to talk about gender affirmation surgery. Some people's transitions involve gender affirming surgeries. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they involve hormone therapy. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they involve name changes, gender marker changes. Sometimes they don't. Everybody's transition is going to be different. And so gender affirming surgeries are what we used to call sex reassignment surgery. And this is when you change physical characteristics to affirm your gender, to make you look the way that you feel. So it could involve surgeries of your trachea to your chest to other body parts that make you feel more comfortable in your body.
Sarah, I told you I wouldn't interrupt and say,
I want you to interrupt me, Sue.
unless somebody asked a really good question. Can you tell us what exactly is meant by a gender marker?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it.
It wasn't mine. Tara Sandercock asked that question.
Tara Sandercock, wonderful question. So a gender marker, if you pull out your driver's license out of your wallet right now, on your driver's license, it's going to say sex, and underneath it is going to have an M or an F. That's your gender marker. So some people, when they're transitioning, want to change that gender marker to be who they are. Other people have no interest in changing that, and that is perfectly fine. That doesn't make their transition any more or any less valid. That's a wonderful question. So tonight we're talking about gender identity, transgender. That is not sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is about who you love, who you're interested in romantically, sexually. So that's lesbian, gay, queer, bisexual, that long list is very different from gender identity. Your gender identity and your sexual orientation can be different. You can have a transgender lesbian, you can have a cisgender lesbian. They're not tied together. So we're talking about the gender identity side of the LGBTQ spectrum, not so much the sexual orientation side tonight. All right, so this is my list of phrases to say goodbye to. I'm not going to go down this whole list, but this is a good starter of some things that folks may say that they don't recognize as being unwelcoming to transgender people. One of the big ones that kind of grinds my gears is identifies as. We say, oh, she identifies as a woman. Oh, she identifies as non-binary. No, she is a woman. She is non-binary. When we talk about cisgender people, we don't say they identify as a man. We just say they are. And so the same thing goes for trans people and for non-binary people. They just are. Same thing with preferred pronouns. They're people's pronouns. My pronouns are she and they. I don't prefer them. Those are mine. And those are what I state my claim to. I prefer pizza, but my pronouns are not a matter of discussion. You don't get to decide what you want in that situation, right? It's mine to choose. There's a long list here of more outdated words that we used to use when talking about trans people that a lot of people don't use anymore, but some people do. And so I want to point those out. So transsexual, MTF, FTM, transgendered, most people or many people right now find those words to be offensive, but not everybody. And so if somebody introduces themselves to you and says, hey, I'm transsexual, don't think in your back of your head, oh, Sarah said I shouldn't say that. If that's their identity, that's their identity. And we want to respect that and uplift that. It is more important that we affirm who they are than try to fight anybody about what Sarah said or isn't said. I wouldn't recommend opening the door with these words, but if somebody tells you that's who they are, that's their identity. And then the last one on here that I want to point out is the middle one, mother and father. There's also ladies and gentlemen on there. Not everybody identifies as a mother or father. Not everybody identifies as a lady or a gentleman, right? That's not who they are. They may be non-binary. They may find those words offensive. You may get them totally wrong about what you think their gender identity is based on their gender expression. And so I default to gender neutral words, just parent, friends, folks, distinguished guests, not trying to create more gender binaries than we need to have. Because like I said, you never can tell. You never know based on someone's gender expression, who they are, what their gender identity is. All right, so Sue, I'm gonna pause for a second. If we got any other questions about this topic, about lingo, words.
Well, I got something, whoops, I got something privately.
Okay,
I'm
is it
almost,
private or is it private?
No.
Okay.
It's a little reluctant because we don't talk about religion and politics here. But there was a big to-do when during the most recent Supreme Court justices hearings or whatever they're called, when she was asked an offensive question, can you define what a woman is? Now, on that slide you just had with all these possibilities and different things that are new to a lot of people and not new to some, how does that question, I'm not even sure, the question is, what did you think of that question?
Yeah, I think that is really hard to do. And I think that every woman will give you a different definition for that. We talk about what makes us feel like a woman. Some women have a really hard time when they go through menopause, they're unable to have children anymore. And that matters a lot to them. Or if they have a hysterectomy, that makes them feel less like a woman. Some people, if they have a mastectomy, because they had breast cancer, they have the feelings about what that means for their womanhood. But if you ask medical professionals what makes a woman, they're going to come back to, there's 8 different spectrums of what makes up your biology to determine your sex. There's hormones, there's chromosomes, there's primary sexual characteristics, secondary sexual characteristics, all the way up to the most important one, which is your brain sex. It's who you are. It is what you, I'm sorry.
No, we know that the question was meant to be insulting.
Yes.
And to make a political point.
Yes.
But I really wanted to hear you explain that there is not a single definition of what is a man or what is a woman or what is a whatever.
Absolutely.
Or whoever. Okay.
Yeah. What is most important is what you know yourself to be, that internal innate sense of who you are as a woman. There's been some really interesting studies that were done, 20, 30 years ago at this point, doing brain scans of trans people and looking at, trans women versus cis women and how's their brain activity. And they found that it is pretty much the same. I think that it really hits the nail on the head of like, what is a woman? It's you, it's who you are. So no, I understand that question was meant to be offensive, but I think, I'm glad it's asked. I'm glad we're talking about it. I see a question in the chat about what the letter X means in MX instead of MS. That's a wonderful question. So we talk about honorifics, so Dr., Mr., Ms., Mrs. Folks who want to use a gender neutral honorific, or who are non-binary, who don't feel like MS or MR hits home with them, feels like them, then MX is another option for an honorific that is gender neutral. It's saying like M blank, the blank for S, the blank for R, the blank for who they are. So that's what the X is for. Great question. All right, let's keep going. So I want to talk about legal protections, and we're really talking about discrimination protections for trans people. This is, there's federal level ones, there's state level ones, and there's also a really important non-discrimination ordinance that Greensboro passed, when was that, Sue? 9 months ago or so, sometime in 2021. Could have been longer than that. It probably could have been.
I think it was.
Ago.
I think it was longer than that, but
I think you're right. Now that I said that, time is weird right now. Anybody else? So I want to spend some time talking about what the Greensboro non-discrimination ordinance does as well. All right, so this is our broad categories of federal protections. I did not list all of them. There are more, but these are the big ones. So the biggest ones that we talk about on a regular basis are employment protections. And the one that gets the big star on the employment category is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Title VII is what says you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of your race, basis of your sex, basis of your religion, national origin, color, that long list that we talk about, that's all Title VII. Title VII doesn't apply to all employers. It applies to governmental employers and private employers with 15 or more employees. So it doesn't apply to small businesses. But this Obergefell, which is our 2020 case, or I'm sorry, Bostock, I wrote Obergefell on this. Bostock, our 2020 case, is our big deal case in Title VII, which says sex discrimination in Title VII is discrimination, includes discrimination on the basis of gender identity and on the basis of sexual orientation. So what that means is employers greater than 15 employees or more, and government employers, if they're discriminating against somebody based on their gender identification or based on their sexual orientation, then the courts and the EEOC, which is the federal agency that enforces this law, they're going to look at that as being sex discrimination in violation of Title VII. So the Bostock decision, again, it's not Obergefell, that was a slip on my part, but the Bostock decision is what made sure that that law applies to transgender people, which was a huge move. There's also the next three are laws that apply specifically to the federal government, and they have applied to gender identity and sexual orientation for longer than Title VII has. Our next category is our housing bucket. The Fair Housing Act is the one that we think about most of the time when we talk about housing. That says you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, and the federal government has interpreted that to include sexual orientation and gender identity as well. And the federal government is relying on, again, that Bostock Supreme Court decision to say sex in all federal laws includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So I don't think that a court that applies to North Carolina has flat out come out and said that, but that is how the federal government is interpreting the Fair Housing Act right now. There's also HUD rules, and those apply to federal funded housing. Those are very explicit about sexual orientation and gender identity. Places of public accommodation. This is an interesting one. So places of public accommodation is like they're anywhere you go, right? Parks, churches, hotels, restaurants, these are all places of public accommodation. Many people don't realize that there is no law, federal law, that prohibits public accommodation discrimination on the basis of sex. So restaurants can discriminate against women or men because they're places of public accommodation. So patrons that are coming in, they can say, wait, you can't come in here, you're a woman, or wait, you can't come in here, you're a man. So that means there's also no law about public accommodation having to do with sexual orientation and gender identity at the federal level. And that's gonna be important later. So just lock that one away about public accommodation. We're going to talk a lot about Americans with Disabilities Act when we get to the healthcare section, but the Americans with Disabilities Act does have public accommodation protections. So there are federal level public accommodation protections for people with disabilities, for race, for color, for ethnicity, but not for sex. And we're going to come back to that. But so just hold that one in your heads for a little bit. In the education realm, there is Title IX. That is the sex discrimination law that applies to education. There was a case recently in our circuit court, which is the level under the Supreme Court that applies to North Carolina. It's called the Gavin Grimm case. That case, the court said, yep, sex means sexual orientation and gender identity. So it's the exact same definition in Title IX as in Title VII. So transgender children are protected in the education sphere with some caveats, but that is the overarching ruling of the Grimm case.
Hey, I've got a question right about that. Texas. You just said that Title IX protects children in education. And then we have the new Texas law where they're investigating medical assistance as child abuse. Can that stand?
So the Texas law has nothing to do with educational institutions. So it has Title IX doesn't do anything to the Texas law. There are other issues that with the Texas law. One of the big ones being a parent's right to drive their child's medical decisions. And that is that's a constitutional issue more than it is a Title IX issue. The Don't Say Gay bill, which is not what it's called, but that's what we call it in the news. In Florida, that does have a lot of Title IX questions. That is a law that got passed that prohibits classroom discussions about sexual orientation and gender identity in kindergarten through third grade. And so it does impact a school district's ability to for teachers to be able to talk about their own relationships. And Title IX protects teachers and their sexual orientation and gender identity. And it also really binds school districts' hands if there's like a bullying situation, if a kid is being bullied because of their gender identity or because of their sexual orientation, and they need to address it at like a class level. They need to talk to the class about why that's inappropriate. In order to comply with Title IX, they're gonna have a hard time having that conversation about why bullying on the basis of someone's gender identity or bullying on the basis of someone's sexual orientation is inappropriate if they're not allowed to talk about gender identity and sexual orientation in the classroom. So I think we're going to see some court cases come out of Florida on this law that does have some Title IX implications. Also in the education space, there's something called the Equal Access Act. That means that if a school allows for there to be clubs after school, then they should be allowed to have clubs related to gender identity and sexual orientation. So like a GSA, a Gay Straight Alliance. And then the FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, that protects kids' private information, which could include their gender identity from being disclosed without their consent. And then finally, all governmental agencies have to follow the Constitution. And the First Amendment, which is our freedom of expression, that can protect transgender people for how they express themselves, who they are, how they identify. We have rights in that space in the First Amendment. And then there's also the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection, right? We're supposed to be treated the same regardless of what our race, sex, ability, religion, all those things, regardless of what those are. So those are also protections at the federal level. So then we have, Tara, I see your question. I'm going to come back to it. I promise. Then I want to talk about our state protections. We don't really have any. There are very few laws in North Carolina that go above and beyond the federal protections that I just listed. And that is definitely is true in the gender identity discrimination space. So everything I said about federal, that also applies to North Carolina, but there's not really much more in North Carolina that adds a second layer of protection for us, which is why the Greensboro non-discrimination ordinance is so important, because it does add an extra layer where North Carolina does not. So Jennifer, I saw that you posted when it was passed. Thank you. I have the date right on this slide, but didn't have it early enough. So to give you all a little bit of history of how we got here, I know many of us were around for HB2, which was unaffectionately known as the bathroom bill. So in 2015, Greensboro was ahead of its time, and it passed a non-discrimination amendment to one of its ordinances that said that sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression discrimination was unlawful in Greensboro. And Charlotte also passed a similar law. And there were, I think, a few other cities that passed similar laws. And the response to that was HB2. So in 2016, HB2 was passed in North Carolina and signed into law by our then governor. And that prohibited people from using the bathroom that didn't align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if you were given an M at birth, you had to go to the boys' bathroom. If you were given an F at birth, you had to go to the girls' bathroom. So that was why it was called the bathroom bill. But there was also a provision in that law that said cities cannot have non-discrimination ordinances. So it shot down Greensboro's, it shot down Charlotte's, and said you cannot protect people if the state doesn't protect them first. And the state, like I said before, there are no state protections that go above and beyond the federal protection. So that was a big deal for HB2 to strike down these local protections that we used to have. If you remember in 2017, HB 142 was passed, which got rid of the bathroom bill, right? That is no longer a law. There is no more bathroom bill as we knew it in 2016. But it left in place this non-discrimination ordinance prohibition. And it left it in place for 3 years. So December 1st, 2020, that part of the law expired, and we were allowed to have non-discrimination ordinances again. And that's when Greensboro passed its new non-discrimination ordinance, which goes even farther than the old non-discrimination ordinance went, and includes sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression as protected categories in Greensboro. So that means if you drive out of here and you go to Randolph County, they don't have an ordinance like that. So when you leave Greensboro, the protections don't go with you, which is a big deal across the state, right? We wind up with, you're protected here, and then you drive down I-40, and then you're not protected again, and then you drive a little bit farther down I-40, you get to Chapel Hill, to Carborough, and you're protected again. So it makes it kind of complicated as you're driving down I-40 and across the state. But when you're in Greensboro, you do have this non-discrimination ordinance here. And so there's more now. We've got more than just these ones listed on this slide. I think there's about 15 at this point, but they're piecemeal. They're not fully across the state. So this law, this ordinance protects trans people and other people in housing and employment and public accommodation. The housing piece is not a huge deal because the Fair Housing Act already covered sex, which the federal government has interpreted to include sexual orientation and gender identity. So it didn't do a whole lot in the housing space, but it did a lot for employment, and it did a lot for public accommodation in Greensboro. So for employment, if you remember back a couple of slides, Title VII only protects businesses that have 15 or more employees. The Greensboro ordinance protects people regardless of where they work. It protects employees that work, in an office of 3 people as much as it protects people who work in an office of 500 people. It closes the gap on some of these small businesses in Greensboro, and this ordinance is applicable to them. Same thing with the public accommodation. Again, if you remember back, there were no public accommodation protections for sex whatsoever, much less gender identity. In Greensboro, there are. This law prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in places of public accommodation. So this ordinance did a lot for the Greensboro population. All right, so Tara, I'm going to get back to your question now. Tara asked for a really good question about how do federal protections relate to state law. So we're talking about the Alabama law that didn't just outlaw assisting transgender youth in transition, It made it a felony punishable by 10 years in prison. It is brutal. It is a brutal law that applies to parents and doctors and people who are trying to provide gender affirming care to children. So the question is, how does federal law apply to that? There is, it's called preemption is the word that lawyers use. And it basically ranks all laws. And so it starts with the US Constitution, and the US Constitution is the boss. If a law violates the US Constitution, whether it's a federal law, a state law, or a local law, it's out. It is preempted by the US Constitution. The US Constitution trumps it. Underneath that are all the federal laws. So Title VII, Americans with Disabilities Act, Title IX, all of those laws are right below the US Constitution. If something below that violates a federal law, then it is preempted, right? It is inapplicable and should be struck down. Underneath that is our North Carolina Constitution. Underneath the North Carolina Constitution is our state laws. And then underneath the state laws are our local ordinances. So Tara, to your question, if folks were going to challenge the Alabama law, and folks already have, the ACLU has already filed a lawsuit, then they would be saying that law violates federal laws, that law violates the federal Constitution, and trying to outlaw that. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Perfect.
Yes, thank you.
All right,
Great.
I have a follow-up to that one.
Great, Sue.
It's about the North Carolina hate crime statute.
Yeah.
Does that cover sexual orientation, gender identity? Does it protect transgender people at all or specifically?
No, not at all. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex. It has to do with, I believe, race, ethnicity, and religion. It makes those crimes, as if you commit murder because of somebody's race, then that has a higher punishment than if you commit murder for any other reason, including because somebody is transgender. Another thing that exists in North Carolina that is a problem is something called a gay panic or a trans panic defense. This is a viable defense in criminal cases where somebody, we'll use the murder example again. If somebody commits murder against a trans person, they can use as a defense, I was so overcome with emotion because of my hatred of trans people that I couldn't control myself and I killed them. And that is a defense that is still available in North Carolina right now. It's called gay panic or trans panic. And it can be a problem in prosecuting crimes against trans people and crimes against gay people. So thanks for asking that too. Yeah. Another good question. All right. So Damie asked if there's any laws that recognize the intersection of identities. So with race and gender and disability. Great question. Not explicitly, but when you file a discrimination lawsuit or you're complaining of discrimination, you can bring up all the ways that you think that you're discriminated against. So if a white man is hired for a job and a Black woman was not hired for their job, then the Black woman may have two claims for discrimination, both sex and race. So it doesn't really, the law hasn't quite caught up to the really complicated ways that our historical exclusions can play on top of each other and make things worse. The law hasn't really done a great job catching up to that and that understanding, but you can assert multiple things. You can say it was my race and my gender and my sexual orientation that caused this discrimination.
There's a hand raised, Elder Cassandra Jones. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, I have a question about the North Carolina hate law that you just mentioned. So if someone uses that defense, they felt afraid of someone, what happens to the other individual? Are they prosecuted? Are they held accountable? What happens to them?
The victim of the crime? Maybe I'm not understanding your question. Will you,
The person A says, I was so afraid of the transgender or the gay person and kills them.
Mhm.
What happens to that individual? are they held accountable or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's left to the jury to decide. So for instance, like we talk about self-defense as being a defense to crimes. You can still be prosecuted for the crime as the person who did it. And you can assert as a defense, oh, well, it was, I was defending myself or I was defending my child. And then the jury gets to decide if they believe you and if they think that the means that you should not be punished at all, or if you should be punished to a lesser extent than if it wasn't self-defense, right? If it was just motivated out of hatred or something like that. So it's a similar kind of defense in the criminal space. Sometimes people are held accountable, even if they say that it was because of their fear or hatred towards trans people. Other people aren't, and it is a problem in some cases where trans people were harmed or killed. Yeah. Thanks for asking the question. So a question that I want to make sure gets answered that hasn't been asked yet is, what do I do if I've experienced discrimination? Which I think is a really important question. There are a lot of local, state, and federal agencies that prosecute some of these laws. They investigate them, or they help hold the violators accountable. So it depends on, unfortunately, it depends on how you were discriminated against as to who you go talk to. So if you feel like you were discriminated against in Greensboro by law, people, by the legal protections that we talked about that are in the ordinance, then you go to the city of Greensboro to file a complaint. Same thing with like housing issues in Greensboro, you can go to the city of Greensboro to file a complaint. If you've experienced or think you've experienced employment discrimination, you go to what's called the EEOC. It's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a federal agency, and you fill out a complaint to go to them. If you feel like you've been discriminated against in the healthcare space, you go to the Office for Civil Rights for Health and Human Services, which is another federal agency that's different from the EEOC. If it's in housing, you go to the Federal Housing Authority. If it's in education, you go to the Federal Education Authority, right? So everywhere you go, you have to find a different agency. There's not a very clear clearinghouse of where you go. But if you are struggling with this, the Department of Justice can sometimes help you find where you need to go to file these complaints. There's also a lawsuit. You can file lawsuits for violations of most of these laws. Sometimes there's little tricks that you have to do along the way, and it's really important to consult an attorney in those circumstances. It is not an easy thing to do without an attorney, unfortunately, because there are some, they're called procedural elements that you have to go through, and a lot of they're not really well known in the community. And so I highly recommend that if you feel like you're experiencing discrimination of any kind, that the first step is to talk to an attorney about what is the best next step for you.
Sarah, I have a question about voting.
Yeah.
If a transgender person is not allowed to vote in person, perhaps because a photo ID doesn't match the way the person looks, or there's a name change that hasn't gone through or whatever, what should that person do? And do you know of any cases like that in Greensboro?
I don't know any cases like what you just described in Greensboro, but if that were to happen, one, if they have to show an ID, that's a problem because North Carolina's voter ID law was stricken down. So we don't have a voter ID law right now. It is currently, it was just heard in the US Supreme Court. They haven't issued a decision yet. So right now there is no voter ID law in North Carolina. There could be one when the Supreme Court issues its decision, but today there isn't one. But if perhaps it comes about and a transgender person runs into this problem, during the election period, there are always hotlines that are put out for people to contact if they experience any sort of discrimination in the election, and they're at the local level and the state level, and usually the national level will have, some sort of election official hotline for you to contact. if you experience other kinds of ID discrimination, so it comes up sometimes in the notary space. People go to get something notarized and they have to show their ID, and their ID doesn't look like them, or their gender is different than what the notary expects their gender to be. Then the Secretary of State is the right person to contact about that. In terms of if the name change hasn't gone through yet. So that's a great question. So we're going to talk about the legal name change process. But once you finish the process, it is so important to go change your name everywhere immediately. And so that includes on your voter registration, that includes on your identification documents, because in that situation, Sue, there's not a lot of help that can be done. It's a matter of you didn't go get your ID fixed in time, or you didn't change your name on the voting records in time. So if you go through a legal name change process, it is so, so important that you go update everything ASAP.
I know you're going to talk about name changing and all that, but I just want to point out that Jennifer Roop is here and Melvi Shaw, and they're with Guilford Green Foundation.
Yeah.
If you don't know Guilford Green Foundation, you need to know them. These are great folks doing important work. And Jennifer, before we're done tonight, I'm going to ask you to unmute and talk a little bit about what the foundation does. But I want to let Sarah get through all her points.
I'll make sure that we leave enough time, because they do really incredible work, and I work closely with them on some name change and gender marker correction clinics. So I'm glad that both of them are here tonight. All right, well, let's keep rolling so we make sure we have time for them. I want to talk about, like I said, name changes and gender marker corrections. They're complicated, especially the name change process. It's complicated. So I want to walk through the process, and then I'm going to put a link in the chat, which I'm actually going to have to go look for because I failed to pull it up, but so I will go look for that. But it is very helpful in terms of completing the name change process by yourself. So first, let's talk about the overview. This is our goal in the name change process. The biggest thing that we're trying to do in this process is to get what's called a name change order. This is a legal document that comes from the courthouse. And so an order is what makes decisions about all sorts of stuff. If you ever get a divorce, the thing that finalizes your divorce is called an order. If you go through an estate administration process, you're going to get orders. These are decisions that are made by the court system. So that's our job in the name change process. That's what we're aiming for, is to get a name change order. And then we take that order around and we change it. We change our name everywhere our name is listed, including on voter registration, Sue, to make sure that gets up to date. In order to get the name change order, you have to go through a kind of unwieldy process. And that is why Guilford Green does such a good job having these name change clinics, so that if you have any questions about the process, you can come to these clinics and ask lawyers, which sometimes that's me, about the process in your own specific situation. But this is the process generally. So step one, you have to gather a bunch of documents. You have to go get your fingerprints taken. You have to get 2 fingerprint cards, which usually you get like at the sheriff's office, but a lot of colleges also have ways that you can get fingerprints from them. And with those fingerprints, you have to send off to get a federal background check, an FBI background check, and you have to get a state background check, so a North Carolina background check. Meanwhile, while all that's getting done, you also have to get a certified copy of your birth certificate. Sometimes that's really fast. Sometimes it takes a really long time. Like I know that New Hampshire, they keep like literal hand files and they have to go get it, and it takes a while to get that. So sometimes the name change process can take a long time just because of all of this document gathering that you have to do. The background check process is really for one reason and one reason only. In North Carolina, we do not allow people who are on a sex offender registry or who are supposed to be on the sex offender registry and did not fill out the registration. We don't allow them to change their name under this process. It's different if you're changing your name if you're getting married. It's different if you're changing your name because you got divorced. But if we're going through this process, which is the process that most transgender people go through, then there's a prohibition on changing your name for being on the sex offender registry. So that's the main reason why you have to go get these background checks. So you've gathered all your documents, you've got your fingerprints, you've sent those off, you got your background checks back, you got your birth certificate back. Now we start the real process at the courthouse. So step one for the courthouse process is that you have to post a notice. And the notice says, this is my current name. I want to change it to this name. And I'm going to do it in 10 days or more. So this notice has to be posted for 10 days. The notice gets posted on a literal bulletin board inside the courthouse. This bulletin board is where we post notices of tax liens, notices of foreclosures, notices of name changes. I don't know very many people who look at this bulletin board other than lawyers and law offices. It is not something that people go to very often, but this is kind of a vestige of a bygone era where people used to go to the courthouse to get their news. They really cared about that kind of stuff. But this is still part of the law, so it's still part of the process that you have to go post this notice that says, I plan to change my name from this name to this name. And this notice has to be up for 10 days. And the only people who don't have to post this kind of a notice is if they're able to show the clerk's office, which is the folks that work at the courthouse, and they're able to show the clerk's office that either they've been if they're a survivor of domestic violence or a survivor of stalking or those sorts of crimes, or if they are in the address confidentiality program in North Carolina, they also don't have to post their notice. So I would recommend, if you think that applies to you, asking an attorney for some help on that one. But everybody else has to post this notice for 10 days. Once you post your notice, you wait 10 days, then you file what's called a petition. A petition is where you're saying, hey, I want to change my name from this name to this name. Court, mother, may I please change my name? And so you write in your petition what your current name is, what your birthday is, where you were born, who the parents on your birth certificate, why you want to change your name. You can only change your name if you have good and sufficient reason, which is what it says in the law. For trans people who change their name, some people really want to put that they're transgender, right? They're proud of that. They want to put it on their notice, or they want to put it in their petition. But remember, the petition is a public document. And so some people don't feel comfortable putting on their petition that they're transgender. Some people would rather put, because that's the name I'm known by in my community, or because this is the name I identify with. Whatever reason is true is a fine reason to put on this. The clerk's office is going to look and see if it's a good and sufficient reason to change your name. This petition has to be verified, which means you have to swear by it. You have to raise your hand in front of a notary and say, I swear that this petition is the truth. So it's really important that you get it all filled out, right? You also have to file what's called an affidavit of tax and child support obligations. This says that you do not have outstanding tax obligations. And I don't mean like, hey, my taxes are due right now, and I haven't filed them yet. It means like if you have an issue with the IRS that you are working on fixing outstanding tax obligations. The same thing with child support. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to pay child support. It means maybe you're delinquent in paying your child support obligations. So you have to have an affidavit about that, because the state of North Carolina doesn't want people changing their names to try to get out of their tax obligations, to try to get out of their child support obligations. And then you also have to have these 2 affidavits of good character. These are from people that you know that live in the same county where you live. So for most of the folks listening, I assume that's Guilford County, that are over the age of 18 and that are not related to you by blood or marriage. And these people sign an affidavit, which means, again, it's sworn, that they're swearing that it's true, that says, hey, I know this person, I know Sarah Saint, and I know them to be of good character in their community. And I've known them for the past X number of years, 6 years, 1 year, whatever it is. And And I know them to be a good character. And that's it. It doesn't say more than that. It doesn't have to say, and she volunteers at the soup kitchen every Saturday, and she loves puppies, and she it doesn't have to say anything more about the character. It's just simply, I know them to have good character. And then you also have to give all those other documents that you've been gathering, right? Your background checks, your birth certificate. And then there's a line in the statute that says, and anything else the clerk's office thinks they need in order to evaluate whether you have good and sufficient reason to change your name. And that's all. It's easy, right? So easy. No, it's a pretty complicated process. And so I'm going to drop in the chat a link to, it's called Guide and File. This is a website that the North Carolina court system has put out that helps people walk through what they consider to be pretty simple processes. I know that what I described doesn't sound all that simple, but in terms of court filings, it's something that you can do without an attorney in a lot of situations. And so if you want to do that, this website that I just dropped in the chat can help you walk through that process and guide you through the process of what you need to do, what the paperwork needs to look like, how you complete the process. I also know that Guilford Green has a packet that you can use if you want to see what the forms look like and type them up yourself. So that's our process. It has to be completed in 90 days after your background checks come back. So it's to make sure that your background checks don't get too old in that process. And you fill out all your documents, you file all your documents, and then the clerk, who is somebody, not a judge, it's a clerk, and they work at the courthouse. They're going to look at all the materials you submitted, and they're going to say, yes, they have good and sufficient reason to change their name, or no, they do not. If they say yes, that's great. We're going to talk about what you do next. If they say no, then there is an appeal process, and you have to appeal within 30 days of getting the order. And you appeal to the resident superior court judge. And so that's when you really get to go before a judge.
Sarah, I have 2 points to make, but go ahead and finish. I didn't mean to interrupt your sentence.
Great, thanks, Sue. So you have a 30-day window to appeal to a superior court judge. That is a more complicated process, and I would recommend seeking an attorney for that one. Just getting the name change order, many folks are able to do without an attorney, but an appeal, I think having an attorney makes it all the more easier. All right, Sue, what you got?
Okay, first of all, last summer we changed the name of my company.
Mhm.
One document, $25. It got done in 3 days. So the question is, are all these steps that you just, went through, are they pretty much the same they were for a while, or have they been changed to make it harder because we're recognizing people of transgender people who are changing identities and expressions? Have they made it harder, or is this just the way it's always been?
It is more or less the way that it has always been. It has not gotten more tricky. I know it sounds really tricky. It has not gotten substantially trickier now that there are more people who are changing their name because they're trans. This is the same name change process that you can go through if you want to change your name because you don't really feel like you fit in with your birth family, or you don't like your first name, or you really want your middle name to be after your grandmother and your mom named you after her best friend, but you don't know this best friend, you want your grandmother's middle name, right? This is the same process that everybody follows, unless it's for changing your name because of divorce or marriage. That is a completely separate process. Yeah, good question, Sue. And I saw there's another question in the chat about the legal rationale for the public notice posting. Tara, I don't know the exact answer for that. I think it is probably somewhere along the lines of, in case anybody has anything to say about it, right? So the speak now or forever hold your peace part of a wedding. I think it's a similar rationale here of, hey, just letting everybody know I'm getting ready to change my name, or this person's getting ready to change their name, so that if anybody knows of a reason why they shouldn't be allowed to change their name, such as they're running from the law or something untoward, then that may be, I don't know, that I'm guessing that's probably the reason why they have this posting requirement. Yeah. All right, so after you get your order, right, we've gotten our court order that says your name is legally changed from the name on your birth certificate to this new name. The fun has only begun. So now you have to carry that court order everywhere you go and update your records on everywhere your name is listed. So if you ever changed your name through marriage or for another reason, it is the same headache if you're trans as it is for any other reason that you're changing your name. So step one is to make sure your name gets updated on your birth certificate. If you were born in North Carolina, the clerk is supposed to change a copy of your name, send a copy of your name change order to the Vital Records office on their own. Sometimes they follow through with that. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Clerks are busy. They forget. They don't know the process. So it's always good after a few days or a week to call the Vital Records office and make sure that they got a copy of your order. If they didn't get a copy, then send them one and order a new copy of your birth certificate, because that's a huge deal. It's very exciting. If you don't live in North Carolina, then you're going to need to send the order to whatever the Vital Records Bureau is in the state where you were born, and get that updated. And that costs money. So much of this process costs money. Then you go update your Social Security number. You go to the Social Security Administration office and you update your name with them. That's step two. That part is free, thankfully. That part is free. You get a free new Social Security card. Usually you should wait about 36 hours or so, 3 or 4 days, to go to get your driver's license updated. You have to update your driver's license. I think there's like a 6-month window that you have to update your driver's license after a legal name change. So you fill out a form, they're available on the DMV website, and you bring in a copy of your name change order, you go to the DMV and you get a new driver's license. And then you're free to update your name everywhere else. So your passport, utilities, school record, mortgage, deeds, leases, marriage license, wills, your bank account, your voting records, right? All of these things got to get updated. Most places are going to ask you to show a copy of that court order. And so it's good to have those with you so that you can make sure that you are able to update that pretty easily with copies of your court order. So that is a pretty simple process, but a very time consuming process. And so but it's just, as you get mail in, send a copy of your order. As you realize things, just go ahead and do it, and get everything updated everywhere so that your name matches your name. All right, so that's the name change process. There's also the gender marker correction process. So again, that is the letter that is on your driver's license, your passport, your birth certificate, all those places that most of them say an M or an F, except your passport. So this year, the US Passport Office is now allowing people to start getting X's on their passports. This is brand new. I think there's only been a handful that have been issued, but they are ramping up, and folks can now get an M or an F or an X on their passport. So people who may want an X are people who are non-binary, people who do not want their gender listed on their passport for whatever reason, people who don't feel like a man and don't feel like a woman, people who are intersex. We didn't talk about what intersex is, but intersex is where when you're born, it was hard to tell based on your body what the doctor thought you are, whether they thought you're a man or a woman. If you're putting an M or an F on your body, it's where your chromosomes and your hormones and your body and all these, the 8 different characteristics of your biology, the societal expectation is that they're out of line. I think that's an overgeneralization, but that's how we talk about it these days. And so that is intersex. But anyways, in the passport world, you don't have to have anybody but yourself say, I am a woman. I want an F on my gender marker. I am non-binary. I want an X on as my gender marker on my passport. No one has to sign off on it, anything like that. It is a self-attestation. It just says, hey, State Department, this is who I am. please send me a passport with that letter on it. Things get harder from there. So in North Carolina, to correct your gender marker on your driver's license, you have to either bring a copy of bring your passport with you, bring your birth certificate with you, bring a court order with you, or fill out this gender designation form. This is how most people change their gender marker on their driver's license, though some use a passport. This gender designation form, I want to say came out in like 2016, 2017, 2018. But it has a place for you to certify that this is my gender identity, right? I am a man or I am a woman, and a place for a healthcare professional to certify. So you have to have like backup. So the passport, all you had to do was say me. Driver's license, you have to have somebody else attest. It has to be a medical professional, but that's pretty broad. It can be a doctor. It can also be a therapist. It can be a social worker. It can be a case manager. So that's a broad definition of medical professional. And then to change your gender marker on your birth certificate, if you live in North Carolina, then you have to have a notarized statement. So again, a sworn statement. I swear this is the truth. Statement from either your surgeon, your performing doctor, or an examining doctor that says you have had, quote, sex reassignment surgery. And again, I know that was on my list of things Sarah said don't say. This is what it says in the law. It says in the law, sex reassignment surgery. So your doctor has to sign this letter that says, I swear that this person has had sex reassignment surgery and their gender is blah. Or you can have a court order to update your birth certificate. So passport is the easiest one. Driver's license requires a little bit more, and the birth certificate requires a lot more. Now, if you were born not in North Carolina, your birth certificate requirement may be totally different. Every state has different requirements for your birth certificate. So if you live in Alabama, or you were born in Alabama, or you were born in California, or you were born in France or Saudi Arabia, it may involve different steps than what is required in North Carolina. So this is only how you change it on your North Carolina birth certificate. You can do these things with your name change. So you can get your name change and update your gender marker on your passport, your driver's license, your birth certificate, all at the same time, so that you get the documents back together good as new with all of the correct information on it. Sometimes that makes sense for people. Sometimes they would rather do it one by one. The trouble with doing name change and gender marker separately is how much it costs, right? Every time you buy a new driver, or you go get a new driver's license, you have to pay more money. So if you go update your name on your driver's license and then you wait 6 months and you update your gender marker, then you have to pay twice. So that's the only reason to do them together. All right, so why does this all matter? Why do people care about updating their name, updating their gender marker to match their identity? The big one is safety. When you think of all the times you show your driver's license, right? If you get pulled over by the cops, you show your driver's license. If you're going to buy beer and wine at the grocery store, you show your driver's license. If you're going to get something notarized, you show your driver's license. Depending on how the voter ID law goes, maybe you have to use your driver's license to go vote. So think of all these times you have to show your driver's license. And if your gender marker or your name is different from what people expect it to be based on your gender expression, then that can lead to harassment, discrimination, or people freaking out and really harming somebody, right? Because they hate trans people. So it can be really dangerous for people to have to show a driver's license that has a name or a gender marker that doesn't correspond with who they are and what they look like. It's also really important because it's affirming. It feels really good when your identification documents match who you know yourself to be. People change their names when they get married. People change their names when they get divorced. Why? Because their identity is tied to their name. Same thing with trans people. It is really important to have a legal name for a lot of people that matches who they are. And then also it's a part of a lot of people's gender dysphoria treatment. So gender dysphoria is a psychological disorder where people who their gender is different from what it would be expected to be based on their sex assigned at birth. It can cause stress, it can cause depression, it can cause anxiety, it can cause psychological symptoms, not because being trans is bad, but because people treat trans people badly. And it can be trying and harmful psychologically. So for a lot of people, their gender dysphoria treatment that they're doing with their doctor, with their psychiatrist, with their psychologist, this is part of their treatment plan to help them feel more affirmed, to help them feel more aligned in their identity is a really important step in that process. So there are lots of reasons why this is really important, but I want to emphasize that government recognition does not define anybody's gender. No one decides somebody's gender other than who the person whose gender it is, right? That is who they are. So if you receive, you're the viewer of a driver's license and you think, that's unusual. I would have expected this person to have an F on their driver's license, but they have an M. I guess they're a boy. That's not how this works, right? Government recognition does not change someone's gender identity. If they're a woman, no matter what their government identification says. All right. I think we've gotten a lot of our questions answered. Sue, are there any additional ones that got dropped in the chat while I was talking?
I don't have any new ones.
Okay, perfect. Then we will keep on trucking. All right, so our last section is about healthcare. There are a lot of nuances to healthcare. We do not have time to cover all of the nuances in healthcare, but there are a few things that I think are things we don't talk about very much in the healthcare space that are important for folks to know, folks, trans people to know, but also cisgender people who are in this space. I think these are things that we don't talk about. It's not the hot button issues of when is surgery appropriate, when is hormone therapy appropriate. These are some more under the radar healthcare topics. One is advance directives. So advance directives are legal documents where you get to give written instructions about your healthcare to be used when you can't speak for yourself. So you're in a car accident, you get really sick, you're in a coma, you're in surgery for a while. All of these times when you are not able to self-advocate, there are documents that you can have that give instructions to your medical providers, to your family, to your friends, or that appoint somebody to be able to make decisions on your behalf. Most of the time, these documents need to be notarized, and they can be filed into what's called a healthcare registry through the Federal Secretary of State. You do not have to file them there. That doesn't make them any more or any less valid. But what it does do is that it means that when you fly to Massachusetts and you get sick in Massachusetts and you left your advance directives in North Carolina, that Massachusetts can get a hold of them through this registry. You also get what's a little registry card. It's like a wallet card that you can keep in your wallet, and that you can give copies of that to your loved ones who need to know this information. And you can keep it with you anywhere you go that notifies people, hey, go check that healthcare registry for my advance directive. And so then after you get these copies, you certainly need to notify the people that may be with you when you're sick, that you would like to help make medical decisions for you, and let them know that you have these healthcare advance directives. It's also good to post them on your refrigerator. A lot of EMTs, when they're like, if you have a heart attack or have a stroke and you call 911, a lot of them will go check your refrigerator for documents like this. So it's not bad to post one on your refrigerator. All right, so what are advance directives? We talked a little bit about kind of their purposes, but let's talk about the individual advance directives. A big one is the healthcare power of attorney. This is an opportunity for you to name somebody to make healthcare decisions on your behalf when you cannot. So you may name your mom, you may name your best friend, you may name your brother, you may name your boss, right? You can name anybody you want to name and say, if I cannot make decisions for myself, if I'm in a coma, if I'm incapacitated, I want that person to make all the decisions about me. So that's a healthcare power of attorney. You can also have what's called a living will. A living will is different than a testamentary will. So it's not where you like bequeath your belongings. This is where you say if you do or you don't want life sustaining measures taken if you are in a vegetative state or you have this unincurable illness. This directs your doctors of when we want, colloquially to pull a plug. Then there is advanced instruction for mental health treatment. This is where if you're concerned about feeling suicidal or being in a position where you are not of a mind where you can make good decisions about your mental health treatment, you can make them in advance, and you can help people know what treatments you would consent to, what treatments you don't consent to. You can put instructions, you can put preferences in these mental health treatment documents. And the last one is declaration of an anatomical gift, right? That's organ donation. We're familiar with that. All right, so this is why this is important for trans people. These help you communicate when you cannot communicate for yourself who you are. So for instance, like a living will, you're able to put in your living will, I am a woman. When you talk about me, use she, her pronouns, use this name, dress me in female presenting clothing, do my makeup, all the stuff. It doesn't matter what your gender marker is on your government identification documents. It doesn't matter what your legal name is. It doesn't matter what your parents or your family or your wife has to say about it. You get to choose how your medical professionals are going to treat you when you cannot self-advocate for yourself. Right? So that can be hugely affirming for trans people to be able to make these kinds of decisions. A healthcare power of attorney you don't make the decisions, but you say, I want that person to make these decisions. So this is really important for people who don't feel like their biological family is going to make the right decision for them. So in North Carolina and most states, they have a process for choosing who gets to make medical decisions. Usually it starts with your spouse. And if you're not married, then it goes to your parents or to your children. And if those people don't exist, then it goes to a medical board and they make decisions about you. So having a healthcare power of attorney can ensure that someone you trust is making medical decisions for you and that you're getting gender affirming care, regardless of whether you've had any sort of treatment or any sort of gender marker change or anything like that. There's also financial power of attorney that makes sure that financial decisions can be made by somebody you trust, not by the default person, which is usually a member of your biological family. And there's also hospital visitation directives. These can make sure that people you love are on the list of people who can go visit you in the ICU. So usually when you go into an ICU, they ask, are you a family member? Only family members can come to the ICU. Well, if your family members, what the government says are your family members, aren't who you think your family members are, then a hospital visitation directive can make sure that those people are able to come visit you in the ICU or in any other medical facility. Now, asterisks during COVID times, right? We learned that there were a lot of restrictions on visitations, but there weren't restrictions based on family. There were restrictions based on numbers. And so there's a caveat on that one, but that can be helpful if there are people that you really want to make sure are able to visit you. So again, this is incredibly important to make sure that your gender is affirmed while you're in the hospital and after you die. Heaven forbid you pass away. These documents can ensure that the way that you're dressed for your funeral, the way your hair is done, the way your makeup's done is affirming to your gender so that people cannot decide, well, I really think of them as a man, so we're going to put them in a suit and tie.
Okay, Sarah, I did it again. I interrupted you mid-sentence. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But we are running out of time. I know you've got more to say, but
I'm almost done. We're good.
Okay, I wanted to make sure we had time for Jennifer to speak to us just for a moment.
Yes, absolutely. I'll go quickly through my next two slides. All right, so the Family Medical Leave Act is a really important law that I want to make sure people are aware of. This is a law that requires leave for employees who are out of work for a serious health condition. Query what counts as a serious health condition, but I think that some things that may count could be treatment for gender dysphoria, could be overnight stays and recuperation for gender affirming surgeries, could even count for counseling sometimes. So I want people to know that this law is out there. There are some limitations to this law. It only applies to certain employers. It only applies after you've been working for a certain amount of time, and it's unpaid leave, but it is secured leave. So it's important for people to know that this is an option that may be available to them as they are receiving medical care. And this is the one that we don't have enough time to talk about all the nuances of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it is another law that is being used and has been used over the past 5 or so years in the transgender space. So we talked about public accommodations. There's no protection for sex in public accommodations, except for in Greensboro, but there is protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you classify gender dysphoria as a disability, and you're able to say that a reasonable accommodation for your gender dysphoria is being accommodated in these ways: using the bathroom, changing your name, having the gender appropriate uniforms and name tags and those sorts of things. There is a path that's being taken right now to provide more protections for trans people through this Americans with Disabilities Act lens by looking at that gender dysphoria, which I said was a mental health diagnosis. So it is a thing that is happening right now in the world. It is a very unsettled area of the law, but I did want to make sure that folks knew that this is also out there, that's happening right now. All right, so I will shut my mouth and turn it over to Jennifer, to Melvie, to talk about Guilford Green.
Okay, and right before that, I put a link into the chat with the survey. I just did it again. It's very short. It's very helpful to us if you'll fill that survey out after Jennifer is done. So Miss Jennifer, would you like to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about Guilford Green?
Hey, yeah, thank you. So I won't take up a lot of time, and I'm not camera ready. Sorry, I just jumped on at the last minute. But thank you for giving us a couple of minutes here. And Sarah, thank you. Sarah didn't say it enough, but the reason why we have the resources that we have at the center are largely because of Sarah's volunteer work to make sure that we have those resources available for LGBTQ people. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Guilford Green Foundation and LGBTQ Center has been around since 1998, and we've been operating the LGBTQ Center in downtown Greensboro since 2018. We opened this space in downtown in 2020. And oftentimes, that is the first place of contact for LGBTQ people, regardless of what they're looking for. If it's housing, therapists, name change stuff, they come to us first. Just because, where do you go, right? We're going to go to the LGBTQ Center and find out. And so Melvie Shaw, who is also on the call, and Melvie, I will let Melvie jump in if she wants to as well. But Melvie is our center manager, so she is the triage person for all of those calls to route people to the appropriate services and to provide them with services that we have. So transgender legal issues are a common topic of things that come up, and we're very fortunate to be able to host name change clinics. We usually have about 4 a year where people can talk for free with lawyers to help navigate this process. And then, like I dropped in the comments, we also have our trans voting guide to deal with some of the issues that were brought up here. You know, what if you show up and the name on your voter registration doesn't match what a person perceives your gender to be? Could you get turned away for voting? So we have guidance on that, and Melvie and Sarah both have worked a lot to make sure that we have those things. So that's I guess the main thing that I want to say is if you have a question about anything in the LGBTQ community or anybody needs help with anything, come to us. We might not have all the answer or resources, but we've got great people that we partner with in the community. We can certainly make those connections. And I'll let Melvi, if she wants to jump in and say anything else.
Melvi here?
I think Melvie
Uh,
had to slide off.
I think
oh,
so.
okay. I'm
Okay.
on
then-
my phone, so I couldn't see everybody.
I just want to thank Sarah. You were just outstanding. I can only imagine what it would cost if somebody had to pay to hear all this stuff, but lawyers are wonderful with information and such a good heart to share it with everybody tonight. I hope this helped you. Again, I'm going to ask you to please fill out the survey, which I just put in the chat again. But Sarah, you were terrific, and thank you all for sticking with us. There was a trove of information. We'll get the video up on YouTube, and you can, in the survey, if you fill it out, you'll get email about the next event, which is May 14th. So it's been a long day for everybody, but this is my aperitif after dinner to end my day. You were great, Sarah. Thank you. And thank you, Liz, for standing in for the HRD. And we will hopefully see you all again on May 14th. Have a wonderful night.